I now want to show you a little bit of a better control you can create to control the wind on plants. Now the first thing I want to kind of explain, because a lot of people aren't really aware of it, and it's basically the difference between wind and breeze. If you go up to the atmosphere editor and select the wind, we have enable wind on a per plant basis and the breeze. Now the breeze is basically the overall fluttering of ecosystems and any vegetation within the scene. It's just kind of a global wind and global atmospheric manipulator for all of the plants within view. If it's turned off, then it's not affecting anything. And that's just the breeze. Now the wind is a ventilator or the manual control. I'm going to load in the maple tree. And if we take a look in the top view, there's a little handle and what you can do is select it and move around the influence of the wind. So you can manually control the wind. Wind is, like I was saying, a ventilator or this handle. Now the problem with this handle is it's only available in the top view and not very dynamic or sometimes easy to control. And when you're working on multiple plants, you have to set this up either on every plant and modify it, which can take a little bit of time. But what I want to show you is how you can access the wind and create a 3D handle that is available in every single viewport and is really easy to control. And also animate much easier with a path option, being able to use the graphs that are available, and also time splines, anything like that. So it gives you a lot more control. So what we're going to do is load in a sphere, or create a sphere. I'm just going to scale it down a little. And now what we're going to do is select the maple tree, or whichever plant you're using. This will work with any of the solid growth species. So pretty much every single item you can access within the load plant species window, or any veg file. What we're going to do is go down to the bottom and edit the object graph. Well, you can see that one of the options is the wind. This is set up as a vector. And it is set up as a full vector, which is slightly inaccurate because it is more like a texture coordinate. It's really only an x and y value. The z value usually doesn't make or change the output of the wind. So what we want to do is control the wind, and all we have to do is right-click, add input node, external dependency. And we can select our dependency as the sphere position. Connect our wind to the sphere's position. And now any modification we make to the sphere will interact and modify the wind. At this point, it is way too sensitive. You can also see that modifying the Z makes no difference. Even if we're off to the side, it doesn't really do anything. So we can disconnect that. But first, let's go ahead and adjust that sensitivity, because right now it's very hard to control. So we're going to go back, select the maple tree, edit the graph, and what we're going to add in is a combiner node. We're going to set it to divide, and now we can connect the division, the wind to divide, and that first input is going to be the sphere's position. And the next node we're going to add in is a constant node, and we're going to use a constant vector. And then we can select our divide and connect it to this vector. Now I'm going to set a value of 50. And we really don't need to worry about the z, but I am just going to type 50. And this is going to divide the x, y, and z by 50 and reduce the total impact. So now we have an object that is not as sensitive. And now we can move around and control the wind in any viewport. And we can also get a much larger amount of control. Once again, the z doesn't do anything. But because there is a little bit of a lag, because it is connected to the z, the best thing to do is disconnect it, because we don't want any interference. So we're going to open the graph, and now if you own Snowflake, you can add in one of the dynamics nodes, which is the x, y, and then z, which is separated. And this will work where you can connect from the external output, connect it to the x and y, and then the input you want to use is the vector xyz. That will automatically connect this and reduce and get rid of all of that lag associated on the z, because it's no longer controlling anything or connected. So that's just a nice memory optimization. If you don't own Snowflake, or the Metanode Collection version 1, because Snowflake is the Metanode Collection version 2, although basically a total name change on the product. So what we're going to do, if you don't own the collection, is just create something similar to it, much more simplified control, adding in a math node, vector operation, using the composer 3, and then adding in another math node, vector operation, decomposer 3. And we can disconnect the divide from the external dependency, connect our decomposer to the external dependency and our composer. We're going to use input 0 from the composer 3, connecting to the x of decomposer 3, and then input 1 of composer 3 to the y of the decomposer 3 output. Then we can connect input 0, the divide, to the composer. What decomposer and composer do are break up the vector, or combine it back together. So what we've done is taken just the x and the y, and since composer 3, the input 2, which is the z-axis, is not connected to anything. All we're using is the x and y value from the external dependency, which is the sphere's position. And then the composer, of course, just combines back into a vector. So you don't necessarily have to even grab from the same object. You could have one object control the x direction, another one control the y. And a note about the division. If you wanted to have one axis more sensitive or less sensitive, you can just change these values so they're not equal. If we want to make the y even more sensitive, let's just bring it down to 25. So now any changes made on the y are going to affect the tree much more than changes made on the x-axis. So that's a little more customization you can add in. I do want to note, you do not want to copy and paste your tree. It's a bad idea. Do not use the duplicate scatter options, and do not select the tree and copy and paste it. What will happen is it will just crash the program. For some reason there's a problem, a bug-related problem related to the graph, and when it tries to call to the function of the graph, it does crash the program. So if you want to apply this to other objects, the best thing to do is just create a metanode out of it that you can load in. And what I'm going to do is just go ahead, select all of those, create a metanode, and then what we can do is select that divided number and publish it. And we're just going to call it divide, or you can name it sensitivity, whatever you want to call it. And then our external dependency, I'm going to call vector control, which is actually, if we go to add input node, vector3 input, that's what this is. What this does is adds the connection to additional nodes outside of the metanode. So now we have that divide available, so we can edit that directly and then connect this to whatever external dependency we want. Including external dependencies within the metanode itself tends to vary in its performance. I originally created many tools that used embedded external dependencies, but as updates were made to Vue 7 and the graphs and the way they worked, I found many refresh problems involved with having these external dependencies embedded within a metanode and being able to select the option directly within it. So a lot of the tools I've decided to add in the vector3 input node and just make that connection have to be a manual add input external dependency and then select what you want to connect it to. Because otherwise, a lot of the tools were not refreshing. Sometimes in the material editor, things would show up, but when you rendered it, they wouldn't work correctly. So you may not want to include your external dependencies within the metanode. Hopefully in future versions it becomes fixed, but I have noticed it kind of bounces back and forth whether it works or not. I also want to note that unfortunately graphs are not saved with veg files. They're only saved as for a view file or a VOB object file, or saving the scene itself with the object in it. Otherwise, saving the plant species is not going to include the graph because the primary use is for ecosystems, and ecosystems are not affected by graphs contained within the plant because the graph itself is an object modifier and not a plant species modifier. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If you wanted to reuse this on other species and set up large groups, you can save out that metanode and just make that connection to all the plants you want to apply it to. Another quick and easy way, if you want to avoid some of the connections, is you can actually save out the graph as a function. So if we open the graph, now I am in the wrong object. What you can do is just save out the entire function. And that's going to save as an FNC file. So if you wanted to apply this to other objects, you could save out that FNC file and then in any object graph load in the function, which is going to pull up the Vue browser, and then you can add a collection or just browse for the file. So that way you could set up graphs that way that are already set up. As you can see, I have done that with Camera Orbiter and another metanode. So some of those setups will automatically connect to any of the links you have. So if you have, in this case, we have something connecting to the wind, it'll automatically connect that to the wind. Anything connected to position, orientation, will automatically set up. Now I do want to mention that at the moment, this isn't linked, the sphere and the maple tree. If I was to move the sphere all the way over to the maple tree now, we kind of lost our handle. At least being with the plant. And this is because it is based on the absolute position of the sphere itself and its relation to a coordinate of 0, 0, 0 to start with. So what we'll have to do is modify this even further Let's just go ahead and align it so right away we'll be able to see if it's updating correctly. And within the graph, what we need to do is, since we want this to be included within the meta node, so we'll double click to open the meta node, and we're going to add in input vector3 input, and this will be connected and allows the connection outside of the node. So this will be connected to the position of the tree or the species that we're controlling. So we're going to call this position self, and it doesn't necessarily have to be position. It could really be any vector to control the wind. You could use rotation, scale, anything like that. Rotation wouldn't really work as well because it does end when it hits 360. You'd have to do a lot more conversions. Position just makes the most sense. So what we need to do is basically subtract the current position from the input so that it's not affecting the wind control. So what we can do is add in a combiner node, set it to subtract, and also note that currently there's a spelling error called subtract whenever you're within a meta node. So if you see that it's just a spelling error within meta nodes, what we're going to do is connect input 0 to the vector of the sphere, and then this next connection will go to our vector3 input, and where we're going to be connecting another vector, and then we can just unconnect the decomposer and connect it to the subtract. Click OK, and now we have a new input node, and we're going to connect that to the position of the tree itself. And we can see these top inputs are all for the object we currently are editing the graph for. And these are automatic external dependency nodes that are added in, always automatically by default set to the edited plant or the edited objects that you're editing the graph for, although you can change them. Usually just a good idea to add new ones in rather than changing the top ones. And now we can see that tree is lifted back up. And now we can basically have a connection between these two. So if I modify the tree, it's going to react to where this object is, which in this case it becomes an attractor. So as we move around the object, it is basically drawing itself towards the sphere. Or the other way around, which is pretty cool. It gives you a lot of control. And then you could set up multiple objects to either be connected to the same sphere, but then you'll have to offset and once again subtract additional values per plant. So sometimes it's easier just to make an individual control to have that 3D controller, and then you could even take all of your controls created for individual plants and connect them to one object and modify them like that. Basically, you could also just group them together, all your controls, so that when you move the group, it'll move everything. And I want to make a quick note about the internal unit. If we go to File, Options, Units and Coordinates, I'm currently using an internal unit of 0.1. Now this affects the vectors and their total amount and output within the program, meaning the value of 50 that we have set for the division. If we look at the node, 50 is actually 5 meters. Now in this case, it doesn't really affect the total output, and changing the internal unit shouldn't have that large of an impact. But if you were manually connecting a vector and typing in a number, rather than using another object to control it, you might have to type in a lower or higher value. Because if we were using an internal unit of 1, then the vector for 5 meters would be 5 and not 50. So if you're using the composer with manual number entries, that's just one thing to keep in mind about the vector. And one last important thing is make sure you are hiding your control object from the render. Otherwise it's going to show up. What you can do is just click on the icon to hide it, and then it'll no longer show up in your render. Or you can go up to the top here, and there's a little ghost icon. That'll also hide it from the render. And the sphere material, because I did have the tree selected, it does have a bark material, so you might just want to reset it, maybe give it a specific material, just kind of a null material name. And just for the fun of it, to finish up here, let's go ahead and copy and paste this object. And crash the program. Now, unresponsive. So, yeah, definitely don't copy and paste those vegetation species. Make sure you save out the metanode, and then just load it in to other objects if you want that to be part of it.